All right, so we're diving into something a little different today. Japanese adult video. You send over some academic excerpts, and I have to say, this Japanese adult video industry book,
Mm.
it's got me intrigued. What's the deal with this industry? What makes it so different?
Well, it's interesting. This book, it doesn't just tell you what's happening on screen. It really digs into the whole ideology behind these videos, like why they're made, why people watch them. I think that's where things start to get really unique, with Japanese AV.
Okay, yeah, you got my attention. The book starts off with this scene
Okay.
from a Japanese AV film. And well, let's just say it's pretty intense. We've got this male ballet coach and his student, a female student. And the power dynamic is, like, it's obvious. The woman, she tries to resist his advances, but he's got this whole philosophy of art justification, trying to pressure her. I don't know, it just feels like there's something else going on there.
Yeah, no, you're definitely picking up on something important there. That scene, it's like a perfect example of what the authors call the salvage ideology. It's like this hidden code running through Japanese AV. And it has two main parts. The first is that it basically positions men as the saviors of women.
Saviors.
Yeah, like they dominate, sometimes even forcefully, but it's always framed as being for the woman's benefit.
Okay, so even violence is somehow what twisted into some act of like benevolence. I'm not sure I'm following that.
Right, yeah. It definitely raises some eyebrows. And then the second part of this ideology is the idea that women, they just lack sexual agency. They need men to actually experience sexual pleasure. And the men, well, they're portrayed as having these skills to make that
Wait,
happen.
hold on. So you're saying that all Japanese AV portrays women like this? Like, what about the actresses? Do they have no say in any of this?
That's a good question. And the book does get into like the perspectives of the women who are actually involved in the industry. It's not about saying they're all victims or they're completely powerless, but it's more about recognizing, this complex system that they're working within. But yeah, to answer your initial question, that scene with the coach and student, it's not just some isolated thing. The book argues that this salvage ideology, it's like it pops up all over the place in Japanese AV, in all sorts of genres.
So it's not just about the content itself. It's about why people are actually watching this stuff. It's like how I'm always drawn to podcasts that give me, those nice bite-sized pieces of knowledge. It's like it's fulfilling a specific need for me.
Exactly. It's all about understanding, what the authors call the use value of something, whether it's a product or in this case, a type of content. Why do we choose certain things? What void are we trying to fill? And the book is suggesting that this salvage ideology, it's fulfilling some kind of need for a lot of the people watching Japanese AV.
Okay, interesting. But what does that need? I mean, it can't just be about the visuals, right? There has to be more to it than that.
You're hitting on a really important point. It seems like it's tapping into, really deep-seated beliefs about gender roles
Yeah.
and sexuality. And to really break down how this all works, the book kind of divides Japanese AV into two main styles, tantai and kikaku.
Tantai and kikaku. Okay, those sound like some kind of fighting styles.
Yeah.
But seriously, what's the difference?
Well, think of tantai as really focusing on the individual actress. It emphasizes her beauty, her body, but also her lack of sexual agency. Like she often needs a man to kind of awaken her sexuality.
Okay. And what about kikaku?
Kikaku is more about the storyline, the plot. It usually revolves around some scenario where a guy, a male character, uses his, expertise, they call him skills sometimes, to basically bring a woman to climax. And oftentimes there's an element of resistance from the woman, at least initially.
So both styles kind of operate under this salvage ideology framework, but they emphasize different parts of it. Okay. And this is where things get really interesting, I think. When you consider that whole, debate about porn, is it harmful or liberating?
Right.
Yes, the never-ending porn wars. But honestly, it feels like such a black and white debate.
Yeah.
You're either for it or against it. There's no nuance.
And this book, it really pushes back against that. It argues that you just can't lump all porn together. It's really important to look at the cultural context, the specific nuances of each type of porn.
So instead of just like slapping a label on it, good or bad, we need to really look at the message, the specific messages that each type of porn is conveying, and how those messages relate to the culture that it's coming from.
That's the idea. It's about really looking at it critically and understanding, the power dynamics, the ideologies, and the effects it might have on viewers.
I can already see how this deep dive is going way beyond just watching a couple of videos. But if we're going to unpack this whole ideology, I'd really like to hear more about these two styles of Japanese AV, tantai and kikaku.
Let's do it. We can talk more about how they're actually produced and how that reflects the salvage ideology, which I think is really fascinating.
All right. You got me hooked. Let's jump in.
So yeah, this salvage ideology, it really is everywhere in the Japanese AV industry. And to really understand it, I think we need to look at how it actually plays out in the production side of things.
Yes, please. Give me all those juicy behind-the-scenes details. This book mentions, like, this whole network involved, right? Like, AV makers, agencies, production companies, even self-regulatory organizations. It's like a whole world in itself.
It really is. And it's surprisingly complex, too. You've got these major players, they call them the big five AV makers, and they pretty much control the whole market. They're kind of like, the Hollywood studio system, but for Japanese AV.
Ooh, the big five. So are they all, like, working together, or is it more of a battle royale?
Well, it's interesting. The book describes them more like a cartel. Working together to maintain their power. They'd collaborate to control things like distribution, pricing, and they even limited competition from smaller companies trying to break in.
Wow, so they were calling all the shots.
Okay.
They decided what kind of content got made
Yeah.
and who got to see it.
Pretty much, yeah. And they had this self-regulatory organization. It was almost like a censorship board, to enforce their control. The book talks about this fascinating case study. This new AV maker, Diamond Image, tried to enter the market. And the big five basically used this self-regulatory group to shut them down.
That's pretty ruthless. So they weren't just controlling the content, they controlled who got to make it, too.
Exactly. It was all about maintaining their power within the industry. And this is where it ties back to the salvage ideology, because by controlling production, they were making sure those core beliefs about gender and sexuality, they stayed on screen.
So it's like this cycle, right? Where the ideology shapes the whole industry, and then the industry reinforces those same beliefs.
Yeah.
It's kind of a scary thought.
Yeah, it's definitely complex. And it leads us to, how those differences between tantai and kikaku, how they show up in the actual production process.
Okay, yeah, let's pull back the curtain on that. What's different about how these two styles are made?
Well, the book goes into how everything is different. From the story to the genres, even how they package and price the videos. It all depends on whether it's tantai or kikaku. For example, tantai AVs, they tend to be priced higher. And they're often marketed to a really specific audience. People who are drawn to that, focus on the individual actress.
So it's almost like they're selling the actress as much as the content itself.
You got it. And that plays right into that whole salvage ideology thing, where women are seen as lacking agency and they need a man to, fulfill their desires. With tantai, the focus is on the woman's beauty, her submission, and her eventual awakening through her interactions with the male performer.
So they're playing on those fantasies, right? Of the, innocent woman who needs to be rescued.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that the book, it doesn't shy away from how problematic that is. Kikaku, on the other hand, it's a bit different. It's driven more by the storyline, the plot. And it often highlights the male character's skills in, seducing or dominating the woman.
Okay, so it's more of a traditional story structure.
Yeah.
Where the woman is the object of conquest.
You could say that, but it still operates within that salvage ideology framework. The woman might resist at first, but the male character's actions, they're always presented as being, for her own good, even if it involves force or manipulation.
Right, so both styles still have men as the ones in control. The ones with the power and the knowledge to, to fulfill women's desires.
That's the common thread running through both tantai and kikaku. And what's interesting is that these different styles, they appeal to different types of viewers.
Wait, so there are different types of fans who specifically look for either tantai or kikaku.
Exactly. And the book dives into how, those preferences are shaped, whether consciously or not, by the salvage ideology. Fans of tantai, they might be drawn to the actress's vulnerability, her innocence, while kikaku fans might be more interested in those power dynamics, that sense of male dominance.
So they're not just watching the content, they're buying into the whole ideology, the fantasy, the worldview.
That's it. It's not just about the visuals, it's about fulfilling some deeper psychological need, even if that need is based on some messed up beliefs.
This is all really fascinating, but it's hard to ignore the parts that are just, disturbing.
Yeah.
The whole idea behind the salvage ideology, it just feels wrong, especially that idea of women needing men to save them.
Yeah, it's a problematic concept for sure. There's no denying that. But remember, the book isn't saying this ideology is right. It's more about understanding how these beliefs have shaped the industry and the culture around it.
Right, it's like a cultural analysis, holding up a mirror to society and saying, hey, look, this is happening, we need to talk about it.
Exactly. And a key part of the book is that it lets the women involved speak for themselves. The 80 actresses, it has a whole chapter dedicated to their stories, their reasons for joining the industry.
That's so important. It's easy to get caught up in the male perspective, but we need to hear from the women who are making these videos. What are their stories?
The book really challenges that assumption that these women are all victims or that they're being forced into the industry. Their reasons for doing it, they're complex and they're different for each woman. It's influenced by, social stuff, economic stuff specific to Japan.
So it's not as simple as saying they're all being exploited.
Not at all. For some, it's a purely financial decision. For others, it might be about seeking fame or attention. And for some, it might even be about exploring their own sexuality or challenging societal norms.
It's important to acknowledge that they have choices, you know, even within a system like this.
Absolutely. And that's why the book pushes for a more, a more nuanced view of the whole thing rather than making sweeping judgments.
This whole deep dive has really got me thinking,
Yeah,
about my own assumptions and looking at things from different perspectives.
that's what we're aiming for. But we're not done yet. We haven't even gotten into the details of the casting calls and the actual filming process. That's where you really see the salvage ideology playing out.
Oh man, I am so ready for those behind the scenes details. Let's get into it. All right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty, the actual making of these Japanese AVs.
Yeah.
Casting calls, filming, all that. What's it actually like?
This is where the book gets really interesting. It takes you right inside the process with some pretty incredible observations.
Okay, yeah. The book talks about a casting call observation, and it sounds, well, a little unusual.
Yeah, it's definitely unique. They actually got to observe a casting interview for a kikaku AV, and it's fascinating, You can see how the salvage ideology we've been talking about, it's already present at this early stage.
So what does a casting call for, like, a kikaku film even look like? Is it like a regular job interview, resumes, questions about experience?
Not really, no. The book describes how the women, the actress candidates, they're actually required to be nude during the interview. And the casting director, he's really focused on their physical attributes and their perceived ability to embody those submissive, passive roles that are so common in kikaku.
Wait, hold on. Nude interviews. That's kind of messed up. Is that even legal?
Yeah, it's definitely different from, normal hiring practices. And the book acknowledges that potential for exploitation, but also brings up this interesting point about how this industry, it operates with its own set of norms. It's like everyone involved agrees to play by a different set of rules.
So it's like its own little world,
Yeah.
with its own culture, its own expectations. But those expectations are still, kind of problematic, especially if they're based on this salvage ideology.
Right. And the casting director in this observation, he's specifically looking for women who fit this specific mold, the innocent, naive woman who needs a man to guide her sexually, which of course reinforces that whole lack of agency thing.
So they're not just casting for a role, they're casting for a fantasy. And that fantasy is based on this whole messed up belief system.
Exactly. And it becomes even more obvious when you look at the actual filming process. The book describes a kikaku AV shoot in detail. It's fascinating, but also, yeah, disturbing.
So what happens on set? How does this ideology, actually play out during filming?
Well, the particular kikaku film they observed, it's centered around the male character, a director, bringing the woman to multiple orgasms, using various, let's just say, techniques. And the woman, she's portrayed as having zero agency. It's like her role is to be there for the man's pleasure.
Well, it's like a textbook example of the salvage ideology in action,
Yeah.
right? The man's the expert, the savior. The woman's totally passive.
It really is. And what's interesting is both the director and the actress, they're working to make it seem as realistic as possible. They're both invested in selling this fantasy, even though it's based on this really skewed power dynamic.
It's like the actress is, I don't know, complicit in perpetuating the ideology, even if she doesn't actually believe it. I imagine there's a lot of pressure to conform.
That's the tough question, right? Is she a victim of the system or is she choosing to participate? And there's no easy answer. It's important to remember these women are individuals with their own reasons for being there.
Right. She's caught in this web, societal expectations, financial pressures, maybe even her own internalized beliefs about gender and all that.
Exactly. And the book, it doesn't shy away from those realities, but it also encourages us to look beyond those simple judgments and, really consider the whole context.
Okay, yeah. So what about the organizations that are supposed to be regulating this industry? Like the book mentions some self-regulatory bodies. What do they do?
Ah, that's a great question. These organizations, they claim to be like the moral compass of the industry. They set the ethical standards, but the book suggests they might actually be making things worse rather than better.
Really?
Ah,
How so?
well, their focus tends to be on censorship. But that censorship often reinforces those existing gender stereotypes and power imbalances.
So instead of like pushing for more ethical practices, they're upholding the status quo.
Yeah, in a way. And that's why this book is so important. It calls for a more critical, a more nuanced understanding of the Japanese AV industry. There are no easy answers, no quick fixes. It's about recognizing that it's this whole complex web, of cultural beliefs, economic forces, individual choices.
Man, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive. I have to admit, I never thought I'd be this interested in learning about the Japanese AV industry.
Yeah, it's a topic that deserves more attention, more thoughtful discussion. Too often it's either dismissed or sensationalized.
Right. Well, this has definitely been a reminder that there's always more to learn and that challenging our assumptions can lead to some pretty fascinating places.
Mhm.
So to our listeners, we'll leave you with this. If the media we consume reflects our cultural values, what does this whole salvage ideology in Japanese AV say about Japanese society? And, think about how your own cultural norms might shape the kind of adult entertainment you see. Keep exploring, stay curious, and we'll see you next time.